Okay, well, I guess we'll get started. There may be some people still filtering in. Thank you for joining us. This is the 11 a.m. session on who's winning the debate over free trade and industrial policy. So it's a bit of a meta debate, and I think we're going to get into kind of both the political and the practical and maybe some of the philosophical elements of this discussion. I've been told to keep the introduction very brief, so I will simply say that I'm Eric Boehm. I'm a reporter for Reason Magazine. To my right is Dominic Pinto. Pino, he is the Thomas Rhodes Scholar. The Thomas Rhodes Journalism Fellow at the National Review Institute. And to my left is Mark DiPlacido. He is the policy advisor for American Compass. They're going to take over and handle, I think, most of the debate, the two sides of which will, I think, become pretty clear as we get going here. We're going to start with a couple of opening statements from each of them. We'll have a little bit of back and forth and discussion, and then we'll wrap up with closing statements as well. We flipped a Bitcoin before we started, and Dom won, so he's going to get us started here. Dominic, the floor is yours.
All right, thank you, Eric, and thanks everybody for coming and listening. The topic is who's winning the debate on free trade, and I think politically the answer is pretty obvious. It's not me. I'm the free trade side of this debate. Both candidates in the last election ran on protectionist platforms. Both of the previous two administrations, one Republican, one Democrat, have done lots of protectionist policies in office. So look, politically, it's not winning the debate. I think that's pretty clear. But I work at National Review, and Bill Buckley said that we believe the truth is not arrived at by monitoring election results. And so I think the economic case for free trade is just as strong as it was in the past. I think it makes perfect sense. But I don't want to bore you with a bunch of graphs and theory today. I just want to convince you of two things. And even if you don't agree with me on everything about free trade, I just want to convince you of these two things. The first is that countries don't trade with each other. People trade with each other. This is an important thing to understand. If you understand why it's perfectly fine for someone in New York City to trade with someone in Albany, why it's perfectly fine for someone in New York City to trade with somebody in Vermont, which, by the way, the Constitution guarantees that we have an interstate free trade zone. It's exactly the same principle as someone in New York City trading with someone in Ontario. Just because you introduce a national border there does not make a difference to the general principle. The second point is that protectionism is the idealistic position. A lot of times free traders get called idealistic, utopian, etc. In my view, free trade is actually just how we live our everyday lives. We go to the store, we buy stuff, we exchange our money for stuff. We do it all the time. The protectionist position says that actually the federal government can make that work better, and it will do so in the national interest, not in the self-interest of the politicians who are doing it, and not in the interest of the lobbyists who are lobbying the federal government to get it to work certain ways. It will actually do it in your interest, and I think that is an idealistic position as opposed to free trade.
Mark, sure. Absolutely. I want to thank the organization as well for having me here. It's great to be with everybody today. I think what I would start by doing is sort of stepping back. I think Dominic is obviously right that not just the Republican Party and Donald Trump have embraced sort of a more protectionist view of trade. I think he's obviously right with that, and that's the direction that American politics is headed. I think basically every politician now has to acknowledge the China shock that happened when China was let into the WTO in the early 2000s, and it has to frame sort of the trade conversation in a way that acknowledges that the middle and the working class have been left behind in our country. And I guess to sort of counterpose two principal points to start out with, I'd rely on the concepts that Donald Trump popularized, and that ultimately, I think, won him the election, both in 2016 and again in 2024. Above a pool of candidates, 16 or 17 Republican candidates in 2016, and a few additional challengers in 2024. The points he ran on were making America great again and putting America first. Both of those phrases have the word America in it, and they both inspire an acknowledgement of people being grounded in a country, in a community, and I would add as well, in families and in cities that have industries that dominate the economy. And so I think we broke out of this individualistic way of thinking about politics and economics that might have made sense when you had a global threat of communism during the Cold War, but ultimately the model that dichotomy set up 40 years ago is not the dichotomy we have today. and a lot of the underlying economic realities have been much different today than they've been 40 years ago.
Yeah. Two quick notes, things that I should have said at the beginning, and I didn't. One is thank you so far for keeping the applause to a minimum. But if somebody makes a good point, this is meant to be a debate. And I love like the old Oxford style of debates where people pound on the tables and whatnot. So if somebody makes a good point and you want to like give a little, thing, keep it to a minimum, but, all for that audience participation part. There will also be an additional audience participation part. We'll take some questions at the end. Hopefully we'll wrap this up in the next 20 minutes or so and leave some time for you guys to ask these two what's on your minds. So Mark, I want to start with you on the first big question here, which is kind of something that Dominic acknowledged right off the bat, which is, look, Donald Trump won the election and he ran a campaign promising tariffs, promising more trade barriers, talking about America first. But something that Patrick Graffiti said in our opening remarks in the other room was that, this election, from his perspective, polling this election, it didn't seem like it really turned so much on those questions so much as it turned on a rejection of the perception that Democrats had failed either at the border or in the economy. So what's your view on the result of the election, and how much were people voting on wanting more tariffs, wanting more industrial policy? Did that really enter into the conversation?
Sure. So I think for the purposes of this conversation, it's less important to look at right versus left and to look more at where the center of both parties has shifted on the question at hand. There's no question that Donald Trump was the most protectionist candidate in the Republican primary and took that primary. Similarly, the Democrats obviously decided not to have a primary, but all of President Biden's rhetoric for the last 4 years has couched things on the same language of supporting the working class. If you look at the transcripts of his States of the Union address, the things that he highlights, his focus on union workers. There's a competition on both sides to win the vote, and that's ultimately the coalition, the winning coalition that President Trump has built. If you look at demographically the country, 64% of people don't have a college degree. These are people over the last 40 years who have lost 17% in annual income versus college degree earners who have gained 20% of income. And ultimately, people are going to realize in that demographic that maybe the economy isn't working for them. We see this in declining birth rates. We see this in increase in deaths and despair. And the United States is, supposedly the most developed country, has actually lost ground in life expectancy in the last 10 years. And when you start to dig deeper into those questions, you have to arrive at the question of globalization. And you have to realize that, the overall growth number, we still had issues with that as well. That's as we've had a very difficult time getting that above 3%. A lot of that is due to decline in productivity and industrial production. Productivity has been flat since 2010. Industrial production has increased, I believe, 9% over the last 20 years. The previous 20 years, it increased 94%. So when you hollow out manufacturing, when you allow industrial policies of other countries to distort the market, and our leaders and our politicians don't do anything to defend our citizens, our industries, and our market, you don't have a free market. You don't have capitalism. You have a distorted market where America is exposed. You have market exposure.
A lot of problems in there. Did he diagnose the solutions correctly?
Yeah, so I would push back on some of the problems stated too. I think one of the things that gets lost a lot of times is that we talk about trade making this huge difference in the American economy. It certainly does. If we got rid of all of it tomorrow, it would be very bad. But you mentioned the China shock. The high-end estimate of the China shock of manufacturing jobs, what that term means in economic literature is the manufacturing jobs lost due to competition with China. The high-end estimate of that is about 2 million jobs over a period of about 10 years. Okay, so from in the early 2000s. 2 million jobs over 10 years, right? So 200,000 jobs a year. That's the high-end estimate. Every month in the United States, approximately 4 million people change jobs. So twice as many people every month in the U.S. get a different job. So the idea that the shock from China presented this uniquely destabilizing thing in our economy just doesn't quite add up. If you also look at how trade-oriented the United States economy is. There's a way we can measure that, right? You can add up all of the trade that happens, so all of the imports and all of the exports, add it all up, and then divide the value of all that by the GDP of the country, which is the total size of the economy. And you can get a percentage, and that tells you how trade-oriented your economy is. So you look at other developed countries, places like Germany, for example. Theirs is about 90%, right? So their imports and exports, you add it up, divided by their GDP, 90%. So they're a very trade-oriented economy. Countries like Canada, right next to us, theirs is 67%. Okay, a lot of their trade is with us, actually. And the world average, for the average country in the world, is 63%. Okay, so 63% trade-oriented. What is it for the United States? For the United States, our trade orientation is 27%. We have one of the least trade-oriented economies in the world. And part of the reason for that is that we have a very big country, and we have a free trade zone within the United States. Founding fathers in the Constitution wrote that in. You're not allowed to put tariffs or import barriers between states. That was a revolutionary idea at the time. France was one of the big countries in the 1700s. They had internal trade barriers. Canada, today, actually, still has internal trade barriers. We in the United States have avoided that for our entire history. It's benefited us tremendously. As far as other countries' trade policies, we should not let other countries' lack of freedom reduce our freedom. If you think about it this way, the Heritage Foundation does their Index of Economic Freedom every year. They rank all the countries, right? So they rank 176 countries. They say the United States is 25th. You can debate whether that's correct or not. We can look at their methodology. It's not really important. But we just know that they rank us 25th. If we can only trade with countries that are at least as free as us, we can only trade with 24 other countries out of 176. It doesn't really seem right. In addition to that, if the other countries use the same principle, those other 24 countries, if they said we can only trade with people who are as free as us, they couldn't trade with us because we're below them. And so if every country believed that, no country would trade at all, because all the countries below you are ineligible by your standard, and all the countries above you are ineligible by their standard. So it's one of these ideas that kind of sounds nice, but doesn't really add up.
Let me redirect that to you for just a second here and say that one of the arguments I think for higher tariffs that Trump has put forward and that other advocates for tariffs have put forward is the idea that we could raise our barriers as a way to put leverage on other countries, a way to create more free trade around the world, that we actually raise the tariffs in the hopes of in the long term reducing them. Would that actually work? Because it seems like, copying, to Dom's point, copying bad behavior seems like a bad way to encourage other people to do the thing you actually want them to do.
No, I mean, I would say it absolutely worked in the first Trump administration. I mean, we put tariffs on China. It increased U.S. revenues by over $230 billion, and it dropped China's trade share with the United States from somewhere around 24% to 14%. I would add, in addition, maybe trade does represent a lower share of our overall economy. I think that's probably fine. But we also represent 78% of the entire world's trade deficit, and China represents 45% of the world's surplus. So to talk about trade in abstract terms without any consideration of the flow backwards or forward kind of elides the entire issue. Like the main argument that people, I would say on my side of the debate, make is that it is unnatural to have an increasing and ever expanding trade deficit year after year after year. In the early 1990s, we had a $30 billion trade deficit. In 2022, it hit almost $1 trillion. It was $950 billion. You cannot have a systemic imbalance year after year for that length of time and not have certain alarm bells go off that maybe the incentives in your economy and maybe the exposure to distortions in other economies isn't going to affect your industry. And I would also say you see this trickle into the effectiveness of our own companies, because once you outsource, you lose the ability to innovate, you use the ability to produce, and over time your companies suffer as a result. If your only benchmarks are shareholder returns and consumption, maybe that model doesn't bother you. But no nation has ever consumed its way to greatness, and most of the American people actually care about the quality of the jobs available, not how many times they can switch in a month.
So if trade deficits were really important, if they were something that really mattered, we would expect there to be a correlation between overall economic performance and trade deficits, right? So I'm just going to name some countries right now that have trade surpluses, all right? Algeria, Angola, Chad, Ecuador, Guyana, Nigeria, Papua New Guinea, and Turkmenistan. They all have trade surpluses. Those are not rich countries. Here's some countries that have trade deficits: Canada, France, Hong Kong, Israel, New Zealand, Spain, the UK, and the US. Now, I purposely picked countries, rich countries for the trade deficits and poor countries for the trade surpluses. You can find counterexamples. The Netherlands, for example, has a trade surplus. They're a rich country. Germany has pretty evenly balanced trade. They're a rich country. But we would expect there to be a much stronger relationship than this if it was really true that trade deficits mattered that much. You can even look within U.S. history. So during the Great Depression, the United States ran pretty sizable trade surpluses every year of the 1930s. If trade surpluses were good for the economy, we wouldn't expect that to happen. The U.S. trade deficit followed a U shape, roughly, from 1982 to 1992. Now, that doesn't help anybody's case because the economy was basically expanding that whole time. That was a great time for the U.S. economy. And at the start of it, the trade deficit went up, and then at the end of it, it started to come back down. Just really doesn't have anything to do with it. The last major decline we had in the trade deficit was during the Great Recession, so that wasn't great. The trade deficit held pretty steady for most of the 2010s when we had pretty slow growth, and then it increased massively during the COVID recession. So I'm just not seeing a relationship there.
Well, do you want to respond to that before I move on to the next thing?
Yeah, quickly, like I said, I don't think overall GDP growth is the right benchmark here, and certainly it's not politically or to build a governing coalition. The question is how widespread across an economy is that wealth, and is that wealth sustainable over a generation or two generations? If the result of these trade deficits are consumption, which is 70% of the U.S. economy, but only 40% of the Chinese economy. Yeah, right now most people would prefer to live in the United States than live in China. But if generation after generation you have a country that consumes $1 trillion more than it produces, you run into a problem where a country has put its current prosperity on a credit card, and eventually that card is going to start to hit limits. And we've already seen in the last 4 or 6 years the U.S. currency get downgraded. Both the new right and the old right have concerns about our debt, and I don't think you can fix that until America starts producing again.
One thing you said in your previous response was that, we saw some of these things happen during the first Trump administration. One of the other things we saw during the first Trump administration was retaliation for the tariffs that the U.S. put on. Retaliation that some in the Trump administration I don't think thought was going to happen. And then there were, bailouts of farmers. There were various other consequences that came about because of that. In a second Trump administration, will we see retaliation for more tariffs? And if so, does that mean that taxpayers need to be prepared to bail out industries that are harmed, even if it's only in the short term?
Sure. Well, I think I could even use, Dominic's statistic that only 27% of our economy relies on trade. So we have a lot more leverage because we have the trade deficit that we have, that less of our industries overall rely on exports at the moment. The bailouts or the support for affected industries were paid for from the tariff revenues. So it's not as if tariffs just disappear into the ether once they're collected. They can be rebated with lower tax rates. They can be reinvested in the economy. There's also points of leverage outside of trade that Trump has also used, and I think that he will continue to use. And the point is, our consumption is a leverage point with these foreign countries, and it only makes sense to use the leverage we have to make better deals.
Are we using that leverage effectively?
I don't think so. If it was true that we were doing that, I would like to see, an administration, get a free trade deal with the United Kingdom, for example. After Brexit, that was one of the things that the UK said they wanted to do. Trump administration actually started going in that direction. They started a first round of negotiations on that, and then the Biden administration killed it. I would love to see Trump sign a trade deal with the UK to own the libs. I think that'd be fantastic. But we do not have this attitude toward expanding trade. Historically, we did, but the last two administrations we have not. The U.S. Trade Representative's office has turned into a place where we try to reduce trade. We try to get in the way of trade, and as Mark said earlier, we reduced trade with China. We didn't reduce the trade deficit, by the way, but we did reduce the volume of trade. Now Mexico is our largest trading partner, so we're going to go after Mexico next. I don't know. So I would say we're not actually doing that. It would be nice if we were, and we do have trade laws on the books that are for that purpose, right? To try to open up access to markets for Americans.
I want to redirect this back to you, and I'm going to come to you, Dom, on this next question. Is that I think one of the common critiques that gets thrown at the free trade crowd and the old right, or however you want to characterize the free market wing of the Republican Party and the conservative movement, is that they're blinded by ideology. That this is, that you're not paying attention to the consequences of people in the real world, real Americans who are dealing with all of these negative consequences, and that you're just looking at the numbers and the charts, many of which you've provided some great data for us today. So I'd like you to respond to that. And in the framing here is who's winning the debate over free trade, and it seems like that argument, even if it runs counter to what the economists say, does seem to be winning the debate. So how should conservatives respond to this reality?
Totally. I think you're absolutely right about the diagnosis there. I would just return to my second point that I had before, that protectionism is actually the idealistic position. And to illustrate that, I just want to give you an example, all right? I could talk about Hayek and central planning and all the rest of that, but let's just get a new example, all right? So there are trailers that are used to carry shipping containers. If you ever see a shipping container on land, it's probably on one of these trailers, all right? They're really important to the U.S. economy, obviously. We gotta move these containers around. There's no other way to do it on land. Most of them are made by a Chinese company. That's a Chinese state-supported company, even. Big problem, right? So clear case for protectionism. We've got a Chinese company that's subsidizing, dumping stuff into the U.S. market. All of our trade laws say that go after them, all right? So we did. And the logic was, hey, look, Americans will have to pay higher prices for these trailers, but it's strategic. They're made in China. It's worth it, and the tariffs will level the playing field. Classic protectionist case. It's exactly what they would want to happen. So protectionists got their way. We currently have a 250% tariff. If you combine several different measures, we have a 250% tariff on these trailers. All right. So what happened? Well, U.S. producers couldn't meet the demand in 2021 when this stuff came in force in full. They said, we'll get to it in 2022. 2022 rolls around. They still haven't met the demand, and they still haven't today. The Chinese company was actually starting to move production to the United States in 2016, before Trump came in office, before the China tariffs. They were moving production to the United States, employing about 250 Americans in Virginia to do this. They weren't bringing in Chinese people to do it. It was all hiring Americans with a U.S. subsidiary. They made it through the China tariffs in 2018, but then the U.S. producers of these trailers asked for more tariffs. They said it's not fair. So International Trade Commission ruled in their favor and said, and that's how we got the 250% tariffs. Well, two can play this game. The Chinese company, the U.S. subsidiary of the Chinese company, said, hey, actually those U.S. companies, they're getting parts from Vietnam, and it looks like the parts from Vietnam are actually mostly coming from China. The International Trade Commission said, yeah, it actually does look like they're mostly coming from China, and actually the tariff applies to them too. Great. So now we've got the U.S. subsidiary of the Chinese company is out there doing that. Now, the tariffs come into effect on the U.S. company too. It cost the U.S. producer $250 million, and they had to cancel a upgrade of their facilities, investments in their own workers. U.S. producers brought another case then because the parts from China, from the U.S. subsidiary of the Chinese company, they had parts coming from Thailand. And they said, actually, those are Chinese. The ITC came back, and they actually ruled, no, they're not Chinese. They're fine. But in the meantime, you have to pay the tariffs in escrow while the investigation's going on. It took months. They lost a bunch of money. They had to lay off those 250 workers in Virginia. One of those workers was interviewed by Bloomberg, a guy named Jarvis Hicks, black man, black working class man. Maybe he voted for Trump. He said, I don't like it, to be honest, because I'm used to working all day. And he would be if it wasn't for tariffs. So again, protectionism is actually the idealistic solution here. Free trade just says, hey, we should just let people buy the stuff and maybe they can employ Americans.
I was happy to let him give that entire example because I don't really see how it's a point against protectionism. The point that we would make is that it's a very sad and unsustainable reality that we can't make containers in this country, that over 90% of shipping containers, and I think 100% of frozen shipping containers, are based in China. And yes, since the Trump tariffs, China has started to route a lot of its goods through third countries, whether that's Vietnam or Mexico, right, which they're planning to do with electric vehicles. The point protectionists make is it is a problem we can't make a basic structural part of our transportation system and our trade system ourselves. And if we ever came into contact with China, which, to go back to your opening, is a very different trading relationship than the one within New York State or across the border into Vermont. And I think the average citizen and the average voter understands that very clearly. So I just don't think that we're the ones being ideological here. If you're comparing a trade relationship between two states in the United States and the United States and China over a good that is fundamental to transportation and trade overall, I think that's in a different reality.
And I think there is an ideological blindness to some extent, and I asked that question there, so I want to push back the other way here. I mean, isn't there some sort of an ideological blindness, or maybe not even ideological, but a blindness to the diffuse costs that come about because of these policies that you have, right? Okay, the goal here is to create tariffs, create trade policies that incentivize the building of, let's just say, more containers in America, right? Instead of relying on ones coming in from China. The costs that are incurred on the rest of the economy, doesn't that factor into that equation?
Well, I would say two things. First, the costs on the rest of the economy have to be taken on net, right? And if you're looking at if you're staring down $1 trillion a year trade deficit and a net foreign asset position of negative $22 trillion, right? These trade deficits add up year after year, because when the United States consumes more than it pays, it has to pay for those goods with our assets, whether it's our treasury bonds, whether it's our land, whether it's our real estate, whether it's our stocks. And we're selling out the farm. As I think Warren Buffett put it over 20 years ago, when the trade deficit was still, when the net foreign asset position was still in the couples of trillions of dollars. Now it's over 22 trillion. Secondly, I would say if you look at American history and you look at the way the rest of the world runs their economies, the free trade era of the last 30 years is the aberration. The first bill that the first Congress passed, signed by Washington, was a tariff act. For a large portion of American history, tariffs funded the government, not an income tax. So the last really since the end of World War II, the United States pursued this position of openness with obvious strategic intent, and with a reasonable case that it was the best way to form an economic coalition against the Soviet Union. Once the Berlin Wall fell, we got hubristic, and we thought that every country in the world would become more free, more democratic, more liberal, and that has not happened. And so the non-ideological case is to recognize the reality of that situation, as well as the economic costs on the middle class, and to adjust your models to the reality that we have today, not to insist that in all cases more free trade is good. And even Friedrich Hayek would have recognized that the trade deficit we have signals something really distorted and unsustainable.
As far as the U.S. history component of that goes, I will, if we want to have the same size federal government that we had in 1790, I will gladly fund it with tariffs. All right, I'm a limited government guy. That would be great. But I don't think that's going to happen. And we have so much more stuff that the federal government does now. There are much more effective ways to raise that revenue than tariffs. Poor countries do generally rely on tariffs for their revenue, because one of the only things that they can control is goods coming across their border. They have very, very poor governments to do very much else. But whenever something shows up in a port, you can have a customs officer there, and he can collect a tariff on it. As countries become more developed, they get away from that, and I think that makes a lot of sense, and is something that we should focus on. Protectionists, I just want to throw something else out there. The protectionists make the same arguments same style of arguments that environmentalists do. And by that I mean that they say what you choose to buy is actually bad for the country as a whole, And the government knows better, and therefore government should replace your choices with its choices. That's true about buying gas stoves, about buying gasoline-powered cars. It's true about buying imports. We hear that all the time. I know that one of the reasons that we understand the misguidedness of that is that Mark wrote an article for American Compass going after Brian Deese, a Democrat economist, for the Clean Energy Marshall Plan. One of the things he said in there was that how industrial policy centered on the working class families entails a distinct focus on lower energy prices, or it should. And I completely agree. I just would say it should also include a distinct focus on lower prices for consumer goods. And we know that tariffs disproportionately affect lower income households because tariffs apply more to things that people in lower income households are more likely to buy. And so one of the ways that we should be helping working class families is actually reducing the tariff burden.
So I would say that's making a comparison of one component of the economy with the overall economy, right? The overall trade deficit, the overall structure of trade with the United States has allowed all of the growth and all of the income to accrue to shareholders and asset owners, especially people who have assets that are based in the U.S. dollar, and that trades off with employment for middle class people, right? So the difference in prices is you have to compare the job growth and the revenue that's raised from the tariffs and how that's reinvested in long-term growth. Secondly, the difference between the externalities of something like national security, which accrues to everybody and which is a broadly recognized part of any government, right? Unless we're going to do away with government and pretend that borders don't exist, which is just a fantasy. That's a very different question than whether the environmental benefits are worth the trade-off of higher prices, and those would accrue, those would accrue to the working class specifically. Environmentalism in certain circles is a luxury belief, and I think that's universally acknowledged on the right, and something the new right and the old right can agree on.
I want to just ask one more quick question of each of you, and we'll do this pretty quickly, and then we'll go to closing statements and questions from the audience. But, the Biden administration, we talked all about tariffs here, obviously, but part of the topic here was supposed to be industrial policy. The Biden administration did a lot of industrial policy, more than maybe any administration had attempted in, 30 years, maybe since FDR. One of the big pieces there was the CHIPS Act. So quickly, should Trump, when he comes into office, repeal or try to stop any of the CHIPS Act spending that isn't yet out the door? Or should Republicans try to double down on the CHIPS Act and try to duplicate that with more of the same?
I don't think Trump should repeal it. I think there's obviously plenty of areas for reform. I mean, some of the extra Christmas ornaments that the left hung on there with DEI requirements, childcare, things that are going to raise the costs of achieving the ultimate goal, which is to have a functioning advanced semiconductor market based in the United States. But I think it's been a surprising success, and even more old right institutions like AEI have written articles recognizing that there's been a 15-fold increase in investment in manufacturing facilities in the United States, that the United States is now on track to produce 20% of advanced semiconductors over the next 10 years instead of 0%. I think some of the provisions that were taken out because of industry lobbying, because of capitalists weighing in a very self-interested way with the government, that stripped out a lot of the intellectual property protections that would have been sensibly put in place if taxpayers are investing in this type of development and research and production. And secondly, that these companies who are receiving these benefits should not be able to in turn invest in China. And I think that's why you saw even some of the most vocal advocates on the new right, like Senator Hawley, Senator Rubio, ultimately vote against the bill. I think on net, it was still the right policy to pursue, a second tier semiconductor market based in the United States is still better than none at all. And we're really at a pinch point in that area of the economy, because if we lose semiconductors, or if China invades Taiwan, which I think it's in a favorable position to do, we'd really be in a bad position.
Yeah, I think it's the idealism of protectionism and industrial policy showing up again because we know how laws get made in the United States. Lobbyists show up on Congress at congressmen's doors. Congress has their own interests in their own districts. These sort of laws, in order to pass in Congress, require 60 votes in the Senate, which is usually going to mean bipartisan buy-in. So you're never going to have like a pure Republican version of it if you think you're going to get that. If you think that would work, and so. So I think the CHIPS Act is exactly what we'd expect to see. As far as a lot of those projects, there was just a report in the FT a couple months ago. 40% of the projects either funded by the CHIPS Act or by the Inflation Reduction Act are currently delayed or paused. Basically, none of the money from the CHIPS Act has actually gone out yet, even though it passed almost 3 years ago now. And so, or a little over 2 years ago, excuse me. We don't see government working as this like very efficient thing working in the national interest because it never really does, and that's why I think it's better off. I think Republicans absolutely should repeal it. I think they should repeal the Inflation Reduction Act for sure, and then they should gut the CHIPS Act too. It's not going to work, and the at what cost question comes in, right? Like how much are we actually paying for these jobs? And the answer a lot of times is way more than they pay the workers. And if that's what's happening, that's a bad trade. That's a bad deal. Donald Trump, art of the deal, he should understand that.
Let's go to closing statements first.
Yeah, sure. One of the points Mark mentioned was national security, and this is obviously a job for the government, right? Everybody's on board with that. I'm at National Review. I want a nice big defense budget. I think that we should do that. One of the problems that we have with that is the national debt and all these other issues. But let's talk about the trade side of it, because I would just like to propose a compromise. In principle, I want unilateral free trade with every country. That means I think the U.S. government should just say, yeah, Americans, you can buy stuff from wherever you want. In principle, that's what I want. But I'll propose a compromise for national security. I will let Mark and protectionists do whatever they want for China, Russia, Venezuela, and state sponsors of terrorism. So that's Syria, North Korea, Cuba, and Iran, right? These are our top enemies. You can do all the protectionism in the world you want with those companies or with those countries, excuse me. I would just like to have free trade with all of our allies and all of the other neutral countries in the world, because I think that would still be great. And it would actually help us to create a really nice, big, free economic zone to counter the influence from China and Russia and all these other places. So I would just propose that as a compromise. And I would just remind you again that countries don't trade with people, people trade with people. Thank you.
It's a little unfair to introduce a new argument in a closing statement, I think.
But I'm happy to receive the concession. If the entire right now supports ending permanent normal trade relations with China, which I wrote a paper on this summer, I think that would be fantastic. I think the argument, though, recognizing that there is a difference between nations like the United States and Great Britain and Australia and other allies, and these other countries that he just listed off, indicates that no, in fact, trade isn't just between individual people, it is between nations. And just because China and Russia and North Korea, fund terrorism and are explicitly bad actors, does not mean there are not other actors like Vietnam, for example, who are non-market economies and have other malignant economic behavior that our own politicians can't abide and can't tolerate. And it also goes back to an earlier point that Dominic made as well, that China is finding other markets to wash its goods to the United States through. And this continues to show up in the overall trade deficit, which he recognizes hasn't gone down even despite some of our actions with China. So the overall problem, and this is the overall question of the debate, right, is who's winning the debate. And ultimately what that comes down to, as I said in my opening statement, is who can win a governing majority. And the fact that Donald Trump won a majority for the first time since 2004, he did that through bringing in a broad-based working class coalition, which still represents 64% of the country, people without college degrees. You cannot build a governing majority without the middle class and without the working class. And if trade only works for college educated people in the current economy and the kinds of people that draw these idealistic economic models and have these ideological attachments to ideas like free trade, which I think has clearly been the more ideological viewpoint in this discussion, then the right will simply not win any more elections. And we'll have more people like Bernie Sanders running our government as a result.
It seems like one of the fundamental questions here, and one that the political system will have to work out, is one we hit right at the beginning, which is trading with someone from New York, trading with somebody from Massachusetts the same as an American trading with someone from China? And I think that's honestly the debate that's going to go forward from here. Thanks to both of you, Mark and Dominic, for participating here. Some great points on both sides. We got about 5 minutes left, so we got time for maybe one or two questions real quick right here in the front.
Sure. Dominic, to your points, this is a question for both of you, to your points about, environmentalism is a little bit like trade protectionism and also proposing a free world free trade club. I don't know if you're aware of this study by Institute for Free Trade, where they talk about a climate and freedom accord. They modeled the CBAM, the European Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism, versus a free market alternative, which is based on free trade. The CBAM reduces GDP. The free trade alternative increases it, by more than the CBAM reduces it. But it also contains a couple of ideas which could fix some of the problems that you identify with free trade. Notably, ideas a little bit like Trump's idea of taxing, manufacturers less 15% income tax rate if you manufacture something in the United States versus 20%, right? So a comparative advantage. But the Climate and Freedom Accord proposes these rapid innovation funds, which are tax exempt debt for cross-border investments in property, plant, and equipment that can fund, all nations to develop their industrial base faster. So my question is, free trade clubs plus supply side tax cuts that really fuel investment and make new investment cheaper. Is this a fix potentially for the problem proposed by traditional free trade that doesn't take into account those things? Is it a way forward even for the Trump administration as an end game, rather than just tariffs for everyone as an end game?
I guess I would just say briefly, I think competitiveness is key, right? And obviously the new right is not arguing, we need to saddle the market with more environmental regulations and increase taxes for increasing taxes' sake. I think there's maybe a conversation to be had about fiscal responsibility that both sides of this debate and even Ovik brought up in the opening. That's clearly going to be a long-term problem, but I think the vision that you outline, the way I understand it, is pretty close to the president's, the president-elect's.
Yeah, if Donald Trump wants to make a free trade zone with lots of different countries, and exclude the countries that we don't like, I'm all for it. We had an opportunity to do that with Trans-Pacific Partnership, and he dropped out of it. So I don't know.
Let's go back here.
I have a similar question. I like everything you said, Dominic, but also want to propose maybe a compromise going in this direction, carbon border adjustment mechanism. So not having tariffs, not having regulations, subsidies, and industrial policy, but having really carbon pricing of some sort and having a carbon border adjustment mechanism. And then you can have something like tariffs towards China and others and have still this effect of having an incentive to go into more carbon efficient production and policies, and still this would be in pro market, and you don't need the state for this. You really can just have the price and get rid of all the other things you have. Yeah, you have to take the state care now. So would that be in compromise for you, maybe?
Yeah, possibly. It would depend on how it exactly would work. I'm always skeptical of carbon pricing simply because I don't know exactly. There's wide range of estimates on what the right carbon price is. And so I have a hard time sort of figuring out how the government's going to really pick the right one and price it correctly to make sure that we are actually internalizing the cost and that we're not over-internalizing or under-internalizing it. The things that I look for more, I actually think I actually think if we did more free market policies in the United States, we would have more manufacturing in the United States. I think the EPA presents a huge problem to building manufacturing in the United States. There's a reason, it's not a coincidence that we have fantastic tech companies in the United States. Big part of the reason is they don't have to ask the EPA for permission to do a lot of stuff. They don't have to ask OSHA for permission to do a lot of stuff. They don't have to, because they're very human capital oriented businesses that allow people to work in ways that they don't have to build a bunch of stuff. They don't have to consume a ton of coal or natural gas or whatever else. And so I think in the absence of a lot of that, we actually would see a lot more manufacturing in the United States. And I don't think we have to get into sort of the economic fine tuning parts of getting the right carbon tax and the right carbon price.
Real quick, can we compromise on that? Let's get rid of the EPA and regulatory burdens on manufacturing.
No, I think I'm pretty much in agreement with Dominic on any of the environmental stuff. There are people on the new right who are a little more open to the carbon border adjustment. I don't like the idea of putting a price on carbon because I know where it goes and I know how, it's a very globalist effort to expand that in the Paris Climate Accord. Like, I obviously do not support that at all. So I'm very skeptical of something like that. With that being said, the United States has the most environmental protections, probably of any nation. We've actually decreased our emissions more than any other nation because of natural gas and other resources, which I'm sure everybody in this room knows. We can't allow the left to in turn argue that they have, like they have in under the Biden administration, that it's okay to export our industries to China and let China take care of things like critical minerals that go into all of our technologies, and have this sort of out of sight, out of mind environmentalism at the same time. So I think the best environmental policy is actually to reshore these industries to the United States. And the coalition on the left and the right need to recognize that for the world, if we want to be global about it, having more production in the United States and more industry in the United States is the most environmentally responsible thing to do.
That'll have to be the last word because we are out of time. I think we have a little break and then lunch. Thank you again to Dominic and Mark for doing this. And thank you to all of you for attending and listening and watching. Thanks.